So the question why we're here today, why do communities do economic development? And as Lee mentioned earlier in the beginning of our session, jobs, wages, increase in local spending, economic diversification, and to build our tax base. Why is economic development important for local governments? Well, as we all know, with property tax caps, it puts a limit on the property tax revenues in the community. So now it's more important than ever to help in doing economic development because of the property tax caps. In addition, the decline in state income tax distributions, as well as the increase of costs across all spectrums of the field: gas, electricity, medical. Some short and long-term solutions for economic development are, one, obviously to cut costs. There are only so many costs that you can cut, though, before you have become as efficient as you can. So then to grow the property tax base and income tax base is the next point. And then to leverage private investment and find additional sources of funds for economic development. Why do we offer incentives for economic development? One is to encourage new business investment throughout all of your communities, to encourage job creation and retention, to target specific industries within your communities, and just the competition among sites between different communities, counties, etc. There are several different local incentives and funding sources that are available to communities. We are going to focus mainly on TIF today, and I'm going to touch on tax abatement. And then here's just a list of several other tools. Most of them require special legislation or kind of unique per community. So TIF is available to every community. So we're going to touch on that today as our main focus. Just to touch on tax abatement real quick, as most of you are probably familiar, tax abatement is a phase-in of assessed value of property taxes. Last year, they have adjusted the legislation, so it's pretty flexible. The maximum term is still 10 years, but as far as the different percentages that you can give each year of those 10 years, that has become flexible, and you actually have to define that each year now. But I would say a majority of communities still use what we call their traditional abatement percentage schedules. Obviously, tax abatement doesn't generate additional dollars like TIF does. And then one other thing, 2014, I think July of this year, you can do a 20-year super abatement on the business personal property. That's just something that was new in legislation this year. So it's just some benefits of abatement would be that it reduces companies' operating expenses, it delays some costs, it delays property taxes going to the local government, and it does not provide the upfront capital incentive that's needed to fund a project right off the bat because of the phasing in of property taxes. Now on to TIF. What is TIF? Again, as you probably all are aware, TIF is a tool, tax increment financing is what TIF stands for, is a tool that captures the increase in assessed value and the new property taxes from new development within a certain specific area. This can be increases in real property, which are the buildings, and sometimes the increases in the depreciable personal property, which is the equipment within businesses. Also, it usually captures the commercial and industrial properties. The purpose of TIF is to finance incentives and infrastructure that's needed to induce the private investment in your communities. It also helps redevelop blighted areas like downtowns, for example. And it encourages the orderly growth. It really makes you plan out what you want to do in that specific area of your community and have a 5-year plan, sometimes 10-year plan for that particular area. Some additional purposes and benefits listed on this slide, a few that I had already mentioned, but there is no additional tax levy for TIF. It avoids the referendum process. It's very flexible in its uses and also can be used with other revenue sources, which we'll get into. And it, in the future, once the TIF area ends, it increases the tax base of the community that it's located in. Immediate positive purpose of TIF is that it stimulates the local economy by providing those resources and revenues to allow projects to be funded. Some costs of TIF: if there is no excess or pass-through TIF, the other taxing units forego the increase in assessed value until the TIF area is again ending. And then TIF bonds, if you decide to fund a project with TIF bonds, they require extra security and credit enhancement, and sometimes higher financing costs, which we will get into. What can TIF be used for? Any projects that facilitate economic development. For example, roads, road infrastructure, rail, utility improvements, land acquisition and site development, buildings, equipment. How can TIF be used to fund projects? They can be used on a pay-as-you-go basis, or you can issue short or long-term bonds to finance a project with the TIF revenues. We wanted to provide you the next 3 slides provide you examples of communities throughout the state that have used TIF for various types of projects. Thought it would just be helpful for you all to realize that it is being used all over the state for various purposes, like Toyota, the AK Steels, SIA, and Tippecanoe County, which they'll discuss, industrial parks, Walmart distribution, Anson, more industrial parks, which Corey will talk about in Henry County in a minute, downtown arts districts in Carmel, for example, and then Noblesville, Mishawaka, Winona Lake, various ones who have used it for downtown redevelopment projects. This is just a quick slide just for your guys' reference. For the most part, I'm not going to go through every detail, but it's basically the procedures that are needed to create a TIF area. And just so you're all aware that it goes through the Redevelopment Commission, the Plan Commission, the council, whether it's city, town, county council, goes through a public hearing, and then back to the councils for their approval. The TIF is calculated, an allocation area is established with a base date. That base date is as of the prior March 1. The existing assessed value, which is within the TIF area boundaries, become the base value. And then any increases above that base value is what the incremental assessed value is. That is then taken times the tax rate divided by 100, and that gives you the TIF revenue that would be generated within that area. For example, the city or town or county boundaries would become the redevelopment district within the county. Within the redevelopment district, within your city or town or county, you would set up an economic development area. Within that, or coterminous with the boundaries of the economic development area, you create an allocation area. The allocation area is what allows you to legally capture the increases in assessed value that are the TIF revenues to be generated in that area. So this is just to show you an illustration. Another illustration is, for example, this slide shows you that this barn is currently in the base of the TIF area. So if the farm, whatever it may be, makes up what we call the base of the TIF area. So whatever buildings or assessed value that's being generated currently when you establish that TIF area is the base assessed value. That base assessed value will continue to go to the county, the school, the library, the city, whatever the overlapping taxing units are within that TIF area. That base value will continue, that assessed value and taxes generated will continue to go to all of those overlapping taxing units. When you create a TIF area and you have new development, new infrastructure, whatever it may be, that new assessed value would be above the base value, and that would be what the TIF, or the incremental assessed value, is. You take that times the tax rate to get the TIF taxes, and those taxes go into the Redevelopment Commission's allocation fund. And those are the TIF dollars that can be used for projects to incentivize various things. But the base assessed value will continue to go to all of those overlapping taxing units. So it's truly, you're capturing the increase in assessed value. The impacts of TIF. A very familiar question would be, does TIF take away from other tax units? It's the main question we get from all of our clients. And the test is this: if the new developments would not occur but for the TIF incentives, then the assessed value from that new development cannot truly and technically be lost. So no. The TIF postpones adding additional assessed value to the tax base, which I'll touch on the next slide. And after the TIF ends, then all that assessed value would be going to the tax base of the overlapping taxing units. So it eventually gets released. Another famous question: does TIF take away from schools? And since the state has taken over the funding of the general fund, it doesn't affect TIF. TIF does not affect the school general fund. It does postpone increases in revenues to the capital projects fund, which capital projects fund of schools is a rate-driven fund. And it also postpones the reduction of tax rates for the levy-driven funds, so all of the other funds of the school district. So it just postpones it until the life of the TIF area ends. Another question is can TIF and other revenues or incentives like tax abatement be combined together and given as an incentive to a company? And the question is, or the answer is yes. But as in the next couple of slides I'm going to show you, tax abatement slows down the amount of TIF in the beginning years that the companies can get. So it reduces the amount of proceeds that you can get right off of the bat. This illustration will help better explain that. So you can see on this slide, this is a $100 million investment with no property tax abatement. And based on this illustration, you can see the level revenue streams, which are the bars coming up. And that shows the level TIF stream. This $10 million investment would generate about $5.8 million of bond proceeds, assuming no property tax abatements. This same $100 million investment with a 10-year property tax abatement would generate about $3.5 million of bond proceeds. And that's because it's the phasing in of it, because it's a phasing in of property taxes. You have less taxes in the beginning to actually fund a bond or whatever it is it may be. Some risks of TIF. Obviously, if a project gets delayed, that's going to change your projection. If the assessment is less than what is estimated, if a taxpayer appeals for some reason, any changes in the economy, if a company goes out of business or decides to relocate, natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, or if a company becomes nonprofit tax exempt, then that assessed value would no longer be there. A few issues affecting TIF bonds payable from TIF. A couple of things you have to keep in mind is whether or not the interest rates will be taxable or tax exempt, and that would be based on the type of project that the TIF is being used to fund, as well as the bond marketability or security of the bonds. So whether or not, basically what are the bonds being paid from, if it's just TIF or if there's a developer backup or if there's a local backup. Basically, who bears the risk? And here's just another slide. Again, if it depends on, the bond marketability depends on the security of the bond issue. If it's payable just from TIF alone, if it's going to be TIF and other local revenues, such as what's listed here in the green box, EDIT, COIT, sewer revenues, food and beverage tax, CREED, if there's a special benefits tax levy, which property tax backup on the bond. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren.
So really, kind of the key takeaways are when working with incentives and TIF, it's important to have some flexibility. When working with companies, some are looking to have, like they may desire more of a tax abatement because that's going to help them keep down their operating costs, whereas others may be looking for more capital upfront help with that. So they may be happy if you could help them with their site improvements or with buying equipment. And so a lot of times they may be willing to trade off less tax abatement for more, to have more TIF to be able to fund equipment or something. So it's important to hone in on what the company really needs and is looking for that when they are looking at locating or expanding. And then another issue, obviously, that Heidi touched on, the security and the risk trade-off. Again, who's really going to benefit the most? So, like for example, some communities, if a project is very company-driven or developer-driven, then they're usually going to have the developer or that company step up and guarantee the financing, the TIF bonds, to enhance the marketability. And if it's more infrastructure or it's a company they've been really targeting that type of a company, say it's high tech or whatever, or certain jobs or high wage jobs, then the community may be more willing to help secure those bonds with some of those sources that Heidi mentioned, like the special benefits tax backup or using their EDIT or COIT. And that kind of brings up, there are a number of communities where when they're doing infrastructure type projects that say they're going to help develop an area, they may help fund the infrastructure and they'll use the TIF from the potential developments to help fund the road work, which will then facilitate additional development. And when they're in that case, a lot of times they're able to leverage federal funds to also help with their road projects. And so they are willing to use their backup of their property taxes, the whole city's property taxes or the whole county's property taxes behind that bond issue. So not only are the bonds payable from TIF, but also from property taxes. And some examples are Lafayette and Hancock County and Hamilton County and Noblesville, Plainfield, Brownsburg, and so forth. In Lafayette, I'm going to transition over here to our folks from Lafayette and Tippecanoe County. They've used TIF and just a lot of economic development tools in very creative ways. And so, and like I said, they'll use different ways to secure it depending on what the project is. So we have examples where they've used TIF for a downtown hotel where they had economic development revenue bonds. They did parking garage, payable from parking revenues and downtown TIF. They've done bonds where the city has backed some of their bonds with the property tax backup of the redevelopment district, while others they've had the developer alone. And they've done series so that the city backed one and the developer backed the other, and just a variety. And the other one I wanted to mention was just they've used their EDIT tax for a variety of things, but I think the biggest use of their EDIT was initially they leveraged really over $100 million of federal funding to do railroad relocation and reconfigure their whole infrastructure. And I'll let Dennis take it from there, but it's just that really jump-started a lot of their economic development, redevelopment efforts.
Just hold the button on the bottom for a minute, like just a couple seconds.
Hey, Dennis, you're on camera. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, now it works. Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Carson, Economic Development Director of the City of Lafayette. And as Lauren mentioned, Lafayette has used TIF very extensively for a number of years. We have 4 TIF districts in our area. We've actually had as many as 7, but we've consolidated them over the past few years and such. And within those TIF districts, we have 31 separate allocation areas. So we've done a lot of expansions over the years and, again, used it pretty extensively. The one thing I will note within our TIFs as well is we have some areas within those TIFs that are called legacy TIFs. And those are TIFs that were created before 1995. And those TIFs actually, until this year, with new legislation that was passed at the State House, did not have a end date on them. So the state legislature has put TIF under quite a bit of scrutiny in the last few years, and this past session they put an actual end date, a time limit on those legacy TIFs, and that's something for us that's a big concern for us because it's quite a bit. It'll really affect our revenue streams in the long term, and it also is going to force us to look at some things, particularly bonding in the next few years as well. So we have preferred to do pay-as-you-go. In other words, we just accumulate the cash and pay for our projects and our programs as we move through time and not bond. We do occasionally do bond. Since 2005, when I came on as Economic Development Director, we've actually only done one bond, and that was last year, was a 3-year bond. In the next coming years, though, we are looking at some large projects where we will be doing some bonding and such. But we've used it for practically everything, all the infrastructure things that were mentioned in here, from water, sewers, roads, drainage projects, traffic lights, sidewalks, downtown streetscape, public art, parking garages, done a lot for acquisition and demolition and projects, environmental remediation, site preparation, and we also use it for a lot of studies and planning and such, and then for consulting, and even pay for the likes of folks like Lauren with H.J. Umbaugh, which helps us out tremendously as we do our projects. We also use it for job training, and it's also a very important part of our economic development incentives as well too. So in some of these slides here that Lauren has, there's a lot of different projects we've done in Lafayette. As Lauren mentioned, one of the major projects that we used edit funds and other TIF funds and things, that was over a 25-year project, railroad relocation, which was a $175 million project, primarily financed through federal funds, but again, we used a lot of local dollars for that as well too. Again, we've done parking garages for that. We had done one in the downtown area. We're looking at doing a second one probably next year, and then we helped out with some private parking garages as well too. We've done a lot of real estate projects. One of our most notable projects was a project that ended up being over a $20 million project that we leveraged with Neighborhood Stabilization Program funds through the federal government. And thus we were able to acquire a blighted and crime-ridden apartment complex called Bridgeway, which was really one of the Lafayette's biggest problem areas. And we were able to buy that because it went into foreclosure. We demolished that site, and in its place, we constructed with a private developer 89 affordable rental units and 10 single-family homes, and then also did acquisition rehab projects of several single-family homes in the surrounding neighborhoods as well too. So we used a lot of our TIF to leverage that money and also to do a lot of the acquisition and the infrastructure and such. We're embarking on a couple other real estate projects right now. One in adjacent downtown neighborhood where we acquired a vacant commercial site. And actually that was an interesting project in that for the acquisition, there were 3 partners in it. Our redevelopment commission paid up for a third of the purchase price. The Lafayette Urban Enterprise Association put up a third. And then the actual residents from the neighborhood formed their own investment corporation and put in a third as well too. So together we formed a partnership, bought the site. We did some site preparation, demolition, environmental remediation on it, and we just signed a development agreement with the developer that will construct 12 owner-occupied townhomes on the site. So we're excited about that project. Again, we used it for a lot of infrastructure projects, particularly roads, and a lot of those are also, we use federal funds, so we leverage the federal funds. There are these 80-20 and 90-10 projects with the federal funds. We have also this year, last year, we bought a fire apparatus truck, and we're looking at buying another one this year, an aerial truck that costs $1 million, and also looking at buying some trash trucks too, because as the general fund has been in cities and towns and counties been cut back, we have to look at other sources. So we're starting to use our TIF for actually help supplement some of the capital costs that we have in our operating fund. One of the exciting projects, at least for me, one of our new projects that we've done, the one that we have done one bond for recently, and it's called Matchbox. It's a co-working studio that we just developed and actually in partnership with the county as well. And then we took a building that was actually owned by our county library. It was an historic building built in 1936 as a Chrysler Dodge dealership and had been vacant for some time. The library was using a portion of the building, but the back portion was empty. And working with a local group called Lafayette Tech that supports entrepreneurship and technology, we developed a co-working studio, which is basically shared office space for entrepreneurs and people that typically may be working out of their home or in the coffee shop or something like that. So it's now home to over 40 members. We just opened up about 4 weeks ago. It's growing pretty rapidly, really been embraced by the community. We have lots of sponsors from our local industry and local commercial ventures that are helping sponsor it. We did do a TIF bond for that, for the build out of it, of $1.5 million TIF bond and paying that back in a 3-year time period. Again, that was our first bond since 2005, but in the next couple of years, we're going to be doing some other major bonds for some major infrastructure projects. The main area where the county and us really work together is economic development incentives, and we use TIF extensively for that. We have 2 TIFs that are shared. In other words, we have joint ownership with the county on those, and we share the proceeds of those 50-50. And then those are in areas where we're seeing a lot of industrial development, and there's a lot of industrial parks and other open land for that. And we've used it extensively as a tool for our economic development. And in the last few years, we've used that to leverage a company called Nanshan, which is an aluminum company from China. This was their first investment in the U.S., and we used the TIF for that as an incentive, and also used tax abatement as well too, and job training funds. With Subaru in our backyard since 1986, we have also worked with them very extensively and through the county, leveraging lots of job training funds for them and using other tools like tax abatement. Heartland Automotive has been another one, which is a supplier to Subaru. And most recently, we had a big win with General Electric, who's producing the LEAP aircraft engine in Lafayette that will break ground this summer. That's a $93 million project with 200 jobs and such, in both the county and us put together an extensive incentive package that included tax abatement, TIF, job training, and other sources as well too. So downtown, we use our TIF extensively as it's a redevelopment TIF, and we have lots of needs in the downtown. Of course, like most downtowns, it's older infrastructure, older buildings and things. So we use it for quite a few things, streetscape, and we've used it for wayfinding, for kiosks, for information kiosks, all kinds of different capital improvements in the downtown. As Lauren mentioned, a hotel development that we did back in 2000, which was the first hotel in downtown in Lafayette in over 30 years. So we've done quite a few things with that. So
You might want to have Tom jump in here and talk a little bit about how you guys work together on economic development type projects, particularly some of the recent ones. And one thing that is pretty unique is that the county and the city actually have a couple joint TIF areas where they actually split the TIF 50-50. So you might just go ahead.
Thank you. Again, my name is Tom Murtaugh, County Commissioner in Tippecanoe County. First of all, I need to call out our county auditor who, when she heard I was going to be on the panel today, said, what do you as a commissioner, what can you possibly share that auditors don't already know? And that's probably true. But I do want to say that our the only TIFs are the joint TIFs that Lauren had mentioned within the county. And the key to our economic development success that we've had the past couple of years has certainly been cooperation and communication. We work very, very closely with both the City of Lafayette and West Lafayette, and also with Purdue University and Ivy Tech, which are also located in our community. And without that cooperation, we wouldn't have seen the success that we've seen lately. And as Katie mentioned earlier, one of the keys to this is that communication, and we meet monthly. Both all the commissioners, the 2 mayors, their economic development folks, and our economic development arm, the Greater Lafayette Commerce, to talk about potential projects, to talk about any issues we might have, to do some long-range planning on future development sites, that type of thing. We talk about everything from infrastructure to drainage to roads. and work out those things. Without that level of communication, it's key. It's essential for this kind of success. So if you don't have those type of relationships with the cities and towns within your counties, I strongly encourage you do what you can to build and strengthen those relationships, because it certainly is key.
Thank you. All right, so next I'm going to transition over to Corey. There is no way to transition over to Corey, so you take it away, Corey.
So in Henry County, Newcastle in particular, and East Central Indiana, was long dependent upon the Detroit Three, and in specific, Chrysler. Chrysler was synonymous with Newcastle. And sometimes if you mention Chrysler now, people give you a dirty look in Newcastle. The predecessor to Chrysler started in, I think, 1904. And it transitioned to a Chrysler plant to about 1 million square feet in downtown Newcastle, and at one time employed 4,000 people. And then in 2002, 2003, they decided to close, and they sold the metal dine, and employment dwindled to about 800. And then a couple of years later, they completely shut down with the Great Recession. And so Newcastle was an early adopter of TIF to try to diversify the employment base in Henry County. And we're never going to get away from manufacturing, because we do that well in Indiana, but manufacturing has changed globally. It just takes less people to do the same thing with technology. But imagine an empty cornfield in your community. Imagine an empty cornfield, not too far off a good highway, and not too far removed from the appropriate infrastructure: water, sewer, gas. And I want you to, if you've got a pen handy, I want you to write down 3 numbers. Yeah, I'm totally off the reservation at this point. Umball will never ever invite me back to do a presentation. I want you to write down 3 numbers. The first number is 0. The second number is 300. The third number is 30 million. So we got 0, we got 300 jobs, and I've got 30 million. Without tax increment finance, in the lower left-hand corner on your screen, TS Tech would not be located in Henry County. It would not have happened. So they talk about the but-for clause in the gobbledygook in the language. You know, but for TIF, we wouldn't have this investment. And so my goal here today is to really rally you around the cause of TIF, because our General Assembly, bless their hearts, they've made it very, very difficult to operate tax increment finance over the last few years. But they're all in favor of economic development, and they're all in favor of job creation. They'll tell us in the next election, and rightly so, we're for jobs and we're for economic development. But when you get down to brass tacks, the steps that must be taken are around the devil in the details. And so without tax increment finance, we wouldn't have TS Tech. TS Tech is a Tier 1 Honda supplier. They make seat assemblies for Honda Greensburg. That 30 million, that number, is their investment. That 300 is their jobs. Their average wage is about $15 an hour, so that ends up being about $10 million in annual payroll. And so that 0 is just to prove a point. Prior to this project, that cornfield had a value closer to zero. And I know there may be farmers in the room. Agriculture is very important. Taxes were being paid. I understand that. I'm stretching it just to prove a point. Without TIF, they wouldn't have chosen Henry County. And what my predecessors did was they used TIF to purchase the ground. We had an option. The Henry County Redevelopment Commission had an option with a private landowner, but it needed some roads and it needed some water and sewer. And so they sold bonds to pay for water, sewer, roads, and purchase the property. And we're able to partner with the state of Indiana to attract TS Tech to the industrial park, really right about as the recession hit. This project announced in 2007. They kicked off maybe in 2008. They promised 300 jobs. Their employment now is over 400. If you go to the next slide. Mr. Doré talked about shell buildings. We have a shell building across the street from TS Tech. We're using in the Redevelopment Commission and a private developer, Runenbaum Construction. There again, without the Redevelopment Commission, the financing sources from county and city government would not allow us to create additional product and an additional reason for companies to consider Henry County. When I'm before the Henry County Council or before the City Council in Newcastle giving an update on economic development, I try to say if there are 10 opportunities, 10 leads that we can submit on, we're able to throw our name in the hat 8 out of 10 times. And that's because of the shell building. The 2 we're missing is because we don't have rail to our shell building. So if you're looking to build a shell building in your community, start a railroad or put it on rail, and you'll probably be able to go 10 out of 10 times. The Henry County Redevelopment Commission has been very, very competitive in terms of having appropriate land available. So I've been in this spot about 1.5 years. In my first meeting, the Redevelopment Commission, without me getting down on my hands and knees and begging for this to happen, they made a motion to exercise an option on land. And where I came from, that would have been unheard of. The local community just really hesitated to buy land. And they did it without me asking. To a certain extent, we are in sales. And I heard a gentleman say that you can't sell out of an empty wagon. And so you got to have something to sell. You got to have something to offer. And it's more than land. It's really about your entire community. But if you have a great community and no site, then what good is that? In the next slide. So the Chrysler facility, the 1 million square feet, it is being repurposed by Crown. So not all is lost. There is some sunshine in Henry County and Newcastle. And so the community, even when Chrysler was still there, they utilized TIF to help support the downtown. And if you go to the next slide. So quality of place, quality of life, the health of your downtown is very important to attract, retain people. When companies come to town, when residents come to town and you don't even know it, they're driving through your downtown, and especially after 5 o'clock. What kind of life is there after 5 o'clock? So in downtown Newcastle, the picture on the left is a real picture. It's a building in need of TLC, and on the right is an artist rendering. Private development will occur. We'll have a groundbreaking on May 28th. It'll be housing on the upper levels and restaurant and retail on the lower level. There again, without tax increment financing, this would not be occurring in downtown Newcastle. And I was really making Heidi nervous because I was passing her notes earlier. You know, I'm from a small town. I work in a small town in perspective. But, you know, the favorite places in Indianapolis, downtown Indianapolis, and I'm not knocking Indianapolis. I love it. My wife even loves this place better. It's a little place called Circle Center Mall. Circle Center Mall is a recipient or a participant with tax increment finance. So if a place like downtown Indianapolis, large, vibrant, over 1 million people, needs to use TIF as a tool to leverage private investment, how much more so than the little burgs and the little towns and the little cities across the state of Indiana. So when you're meeting with your legislature, your members, keep in mind that TIF is critical. I would argue, some may disagree and that's fine, but I would argue that it is our best tool in Indiana to encourage and leverage private investment. Back to those three numbers, 300 jobs, $30 million in investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. I just wanted to point out that we also have included, but we weren't necessarily going to go over it unless people are interested. A few in your handouts you'll see, and there's a few slides on some of the new legislation that came out in 2014, and basically what the impact is on tax increment financing. Mostly it's about providing different oversight on over redevelopment commissions, more involvement of the legislative body of the county or the cities and towns, and more reporting and so forth. So you can take a look at that. As long as I'm talking, I guess I'll mention that there will be review of the budgets. And there will also be, if in the case where there's excess tax increment, which is 200% coverage over obligations and projects and purposes, then the legislative body would have an opportunity to help determine whether there would be excess tax increment and whether that would get passed through to the other taxing units or used for projects.
Can I talk about that for just a second? So redevelopment commissions are appointed by county commissioners and county council members if it's a county situation. So you've got elected officials selecting people to serve on the redevelopment commission. They pick. They can remove them at pretty much any time. But then the legislature comes in and says that that body that was appointed has to come back to that body to get permission to do certain things. That's just one example of where I see the disconnect in terms of the smooth and efficient operation of the delivery of an economic development incentive. The elected officials, you know, my friend here, my colleague, the county commissioner, he ran for office, was elected, and then him and his other two commissioners appoint people. And if they don't like what those appointees are doing, then they can get new appointees. So that's just a real quick example of how I see the disconnect between moving at the speed of business in Indiana and then creating additional unnecessary hurdles, in my opinion. I'm not speaking for Umball at this point. They're really nervous at this point in terms of the impact on the legislation each year.
Thanks, Corey. One thing that hasn't changed and always was, in recent statute anyway, the legislative bodies do have to approve financings. They always had to approve bonds and lease financings of redevelopment commissions. So really, the idea was that the redevelopment commission would have the ability to help redevelop, do land acquisition and resale, and do planning for redevelopment and economic development, and do put together incentive offers and so forth, and then have, if they get to the point of doing an actual bond financing, then they would have the legislative body to help approve that. They've broadened that a little bit to include all obligations, which really doesn't significantly affect most folks. And then also Dennis touched on the fact that they added an expiration for those pre-1995 TIF areas called legacy areas. And I actually, when I first heard that, I thought, well, that's not so unreasonable because all the other TIF areas that were after 95 all have limits. They have 25 years, 30 years, depending on when they were created, and you'll see that in the information. But as I've listened to various economic development professionals and officials discuss TIF, what I realized, I guess, is that a lot of the pre-95 areas were created for downtown redevelopment. TIF originally was used more for redevelopment, and then they added economic development later as like more the greenfield type projects. And so, as Dennis would say, he's probably ready to jump in here. You know, they just got their downtown TIF to be to generate enough TIF that they can finally do downtown projects on it kind of pay as you go. And I know that Greencastle, Bill Dorey will often tell us that, you know, they use their TIF pretty much pay as you go as well. And so they have a lot of infrastructure needs, especially in these older areas. And as most of local officials know, there isn't a lot of extra funds sitting around to do these capital improvements. And so they've been able to use TIF as the way to fund infrastructure to continue to entice redevelopment in their downtowns and industrial park areas and so forth. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that. Is that good? Okay. So, and then we just included a few slides also on the business personal property options that came out of the legislation about elimination. And I'm not planning to get into that. Corey, we're not even giving you the mic right now. But there are options there to be considered. But I wanted to leave it, we have a few minutes, so if folks have questions, we'd invite you to ask us some questions of this panel.